But before we plunge into the disturbing tales of the night, let me ask you, do you have the courage to stay until the end? Most who watch don't subscribe to the channel, perhaps out of simple oversight, or perhaps because, after hearing these stories, they never slept the same way again. If you think you can handle it, click subscribe now. My name is Ethan Carter, and until that night I didn't believe in anything supernatural. I'd always been the skeptical type, the guy who scoffed at stories about ghosts, demons, and curses. Death to me was just the end. No wandering souls, no hauntings, no mystery. That is, until he got into my car. I worked as a mortuary assistant in a small town in Oregon, mainly taking care of transporting bodies between homes, hospitals, and the funeral home. Most of the time, the job was monotonous: load, drive, unload. But that night, something changed. Something noticed me. The call came around 11 p.m. An elderly man had passed away at home, alone, and the neighbors only realized because of the smell. A sad but common case. I grabbed the keys to the hearse and headed to the address. The house was on a deserted street, surrounded by twisted trees and empty windows like dead eyes. When I parked, I noticed the front door was ajar. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. "Hello," I called, feeling an unexpected chill. The silence in the house was dense, oppressive. When I entered, the air was heavy and had a strange smell, not just of decomposition, but something sweet and rotten at the same time. The old man's body was sitting in a chair in the middle of the living room, covered by a white sheet. But something was wrong. His hands were rigid, his fingers curled like claws. The sheet covering his face had a dark mark. Dampness. Blood. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the unease. I worked quickly, placing the body on the gurney and taking it to the hearse. When I closed the back doors, I felt something, as if someone was watching me. I looked at the windows of the house. Nothing, just the glass reflecting the shadows. I shook my head and got into the car. The drive back should take 40 minutes. I turned on the radio to dispel the silence, but all I heard was static. I looked in the rearview mirror. The gurney was there. The sheet still covered the body. Then it moved. My throat went dry. No, I must have imagined it. A reflection of light, maybe? I tried to ignore it, but a chill ran down my spine when I noticed something in the corner of the mirror. A shadow. I tensed up. It was him. The old man was sitting up, his pale and wrinkled face exposed, a grotesque and unnatural smile slowly spreading. His lifeless eyes were fixed on me. I slammed on the brakes. The car swerved violently and almost went off the road. My breathing was rapid, my heart pounding like a drum inside my chest. Did I really see that? I turned to the back seat. The body was lying down, the sheet intact. Nothing had moved. "Just my mind playing tricks on me," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But when I looked back at the rearview mirror, he was closer. Now standing behind me, looking over my shoulder, the entire car seemed to plunge into an impossible cold. My hands were frozen to the steering wheel, unable to react. Then his mouth opened, the glass of the rearview mirror cracked, and a whisper, as cold as death, filled the car. "Take me back." The next thing I remember is leaning against the steering wheel, sweating cold, my mind in a panic. I looked in the mirror again. The body was still, the sheet intact. I don't remember driving to the funeral home. I don't remember unloading the body. I only remember waking up in the hearse, parked, with a suffocating feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to go on with my life, convincing myself that it was just a hallucination, a moment of exhaustion. But in the weeks that followed, something changed. Whenever I passed mirrors, I saw movements, small distortions, dark shapes that disappeared when I looked directly. And then the nightmares began. Always the same dream. Me driving on that deserted road, the static on the radio, and him in the mirror closer with every blink. And on the last night I had that dream, he spoke again. You weren't supposed to bring me here. Now I'm here." I woke up screaming, cold sweat running down my face. I got up and ran to the bathroom mirror. There was something behind me, a shadow. And then, for the first time since that night, I heard his voice outside of the dream. "Look again." I didn't look. Since then, I've covered all the mirrors in the house. And you who are watching this now, look behind you. Are you sure you're alone? My name is Daniel Ford, and this story happened when I was working as a mortuary assistant in a small town in rural Nevada. I didn't believe in the supernatural until that night. The mortuary was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by miles of barren desert. It was an old, cold and silent building where the only company was the dead. Most nights passed without incident, just me and the hum of the fluorescent lights. But that night, I received him. The body of a man, a victim of a brutal car accident, arrived around 10 p.m. The impact had been so violent that his face was disfigured, but his eyes were open, and no matter what I did, they wouldn't close. The first thing I noticed when I opened the black body bag was the smell of burning. Not a regular decomposition smell, but something metallic, oily, like fire had passed through him. The man was thin with grayish skin, and his limbs were covered in strange cuts like symbols carved with a knife. Something about it didn't seem right. But the worst thing was the eyes. Black. Too black. I tried to close them, gently pressing the eyelids. They wouldn't move. I applied some gel to keep them closed. Seconds later, they opened again. My stomach churned. Something in the air seemed to change. The mortuary became too quiet. I looked around, feeling a presence. But it was just me and the dead. I shrugged, convincing myself it was rigor mortis. I grabbed a sheet and covered his face. And then the lights flickered. I continued my work, but a strange sensation began to grow inside me. You know that feeling that something is watching you? Every time I passed the body, my gaze was automatically pulled to the sheet covering his face. It was as if something was moving beneath it. That's when I heard it. A wet sound. A soft pop like something sticky detaching. My heart leaped into my throat. I turned around slowly. The sheet had fallen off, and the eyes were open again. The air became heavy, and I felt an invisible pressure on my chest, as if something was pushing me against the floor. The mortuary door slammed shut on its own. Now, it was just him and me. My body was locked, my breathing short. Then, without warning, the dead man's lips moved. Something came out of his mouth, a sound, low, gurgling. A laugh. I stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of instruments. His eyes followed me. A dark trickle ran from the corner of his mouth. "Do you see now?" The voice was weak, but clearly not his. I felt bile rise in my throat. This wasn't possible. Then he sat up. A dead man doesn't sit up on his own, but he sat up. His arms dangled at his sides like a puppet without strings. His neck fell back, his mouth still too wide open, his eyes fixed on me. And then he began to stand up. That was enough to break my paralysis. I ran. I tripped over the chair, fell, crawled across the floor until I reached the door. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely turn the knob. Behind me, I heard the sound of bare feet hitting the tile. Finally, the door opened, and I bolted down the hallway, not caring about the noise or what I left behind. I left the mortuary and didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat in the driver's seat, struggling to breathe. The building was silent. Nothing came out after me. I started the car and drove away. The next day, I resigned. Months later, I received a call from a former colleague. He told me that the man's body had disappeared. The funeral home recorded the incident as an administrative error, claiming that the paperwork was mixed up. But I knew the truth. He was never buried. My name is Ethan Carter, and for 5 years I worked as a hearse driver in the state of Arizona. It was a quiet job. Most trips were monotonous, just me, a body in the back, and the empty road ahead. Until that night. The night that made me abandon everything. The call came at 11:45 p.m. An elderly man named Raymond Tucker had passed away at his home, and I was supposed to pick him up and transport him to a mortuary in the neighboring town. A 2-hour drive on an almost deserted road. Nothing unusual. I arrived at his house around midnight. The house was old and isolated, surrounded by the arid desert. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. "Is anyone there?" I called out. Silence. Mr. Tucker's body was sitting in his rocking chair, covered with a white sheet. No family nearby, no note, nothing. That was already strange enough. But what bothered me most was his face. The skin was too pale. The eyes, deep set and open, seemed to follow me around the room. I swallowed hard and hurried. I placed him on the gurney, covered his face, and carried him to the hearse. That's when I heard it. A thud coming from inside the house, like someone had closed a door. I got goosebumps all over, but I didn't see anything. I closed the doors of the hearse and set off. The radio was on, but it was just static. The road was dark, empty, and I felt strangely uncomfortable, like I wasn't alone. I looked in the rearview mirror. The sheet still covered the body, but something seemed wrong, that horrible feeling that someone was watching me. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. "It's just your imagination." But then the car jolted, as if something had moved in the back. My breathing became heavy. I checked the mirror again. The sheet was still there, but it seemed looser, like something had moved underneath it. My chest tightened. I kept driving, trying to ignore the growing fear. That's when I heard it. A low, weak voice. "Take me home." My blood ran cold. I looked in the rearview mirror. The sheet had fallen to the floor, and Raymond Tucker was sitting up, looking at me. His eyes were black as coal, and his mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile. The car hit a bump in the road. My heart raced. "What? Take me home!" The voice came from him, but his lips didn't move. I screamed and slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, stopping in the middle of the road. I turned quickly to look back. The back seat was empty. The body was lying on the gurney, motionless. The sheet was still on the floor, but I was certain of what I had seen. My hands trembled as I tried to start the car again. The engine whirred, but it wouldn't turn over. And then the streetlights began to flicker. I looked in the mirror, my heart almost leaping out of my chest. There was someone on the road, a gaunt and motionless shadow. I blinked several times. The figure was closer, and then I heard it again. That weak voice. "Take me home." The sound came from inside the car. I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the door and ran. My feet sank into the hot asphalt, but I didn't stop. I just ran. I ran without looking back. Hours later, the police found my car abandoned on the road. The body was still on the gurney as if it had never moved. The coroner ruled out any foul play. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, in the silent early mornings, I still hear that weak and dragging voice. "Take me home." My name is Nathan, and for 4 years I worked as an assistant in a mortuary in a small town in rural Nevada. If you'd asked me before, I would have said I didn't believe in the supernatural. Death was just a biological process. But one night changed everything, and I was never the same again. It was an ordinary night, shortly before midnight, when we received the body of an unknown man. He had no identification, no medical records. He was just found dead on the side of the highway with no obvious signs of injury. The coroner called me to help him prepare the body. I'd done it hundreds of times before, but as soon as we removed the sheet that covered him, my stomach churned. His skin was too pale, almost grayish. But the worst thing was the eyes. They were open, with completely black irises, as if he had never really died. A chill ran down my spine. "Let's get this over with," the coroner muttered. But as we began to prepare the body, the lights flickered and the air inside the room became heavy. It was as if something invisible was watching us. That's when it happened. I was stitching up the incision on the cadaver's chest. When I felt his fingers move, my breathing stopped. I froze. I thought I had imagined it, but then he turned his head very slowly until he was looking directly at me. The coroner screamed and took a step back. My muscles locked. The dead man smiled. His lips stretched unnaturally, revealing dark, rotten teeth. My heart felt like it was going to explode. That's when he whispered something, a weak, hoarse, and distorted voice. "You brought me here. Now take me back." I screamed and ran out of the room. The police were called. The mortuary was locked down. But when they went back to check the body, he was exactly as before, cold, motionless, as if nothing had happened. They said it was exhaustion, stress. But I know what I saw. And worse, I know what I heard.